Next, we have speaking Dr. Jason M. LaBelle, again from Colorado State University, professor of archaeology, and he's going to be talking about the Lindenmeier site's uniqueness as related to other sites in this region. So, without further ado.
Well, thanks for coming out today. It's really an honor to give a talk today about this topic. I really enjoy speaking about Lindenmeier. I like telling you a little bit about our research in our lovely part of the world here in the northern Colorado foothills. And I'm going to be talking about how unique is unique and kind of hopefully paint the picture, kind of set the stage for the talks that will be coming in the next couple days. So kind of give you some food for thought, some things to think about. So the question is, how unique is it unique? Well, our keynote speaker, Ed Williamson, tells us Lindenmeier is indeed unique. So I guess I'm done. We'll call it good right there and finish. But it's kind of a two-part statement. Williamson would say that the site is unique, but only so because of its discovery, the accident of its discovery, and the quality of Frank Roberts' work there, and not because it has any properties exclusive to itself in the sense of uniqueness to it. And his purpose in his concluding report in 1978 was to kind of present some of that context. And whereas I fully agree with him and I understand what he was saying in terms of its uniqueness, I want to kind of point out some of my ideas about the site and maybe what we've learned in the 40 years or so, or 35 years since Williamson's final report came out on the site. So if there is one word that will draw the wrath of my red pen with my students faster than any other word in the dictionary, it is that word unique. And I was counting how many times Dalen Figgs used the word unique in his last presentation, because we all kind of slip into the use of that word, right? We want to use it because it's a powerful word when we talk about how something is different, distinct. But really, if we look up the definition of it, it really means that it is the only one, or that it has a being without a like or an equal. So the question is Lindenmeier unique? So in today's presentation, I have a couple things I'm going to do. I'm going to briefly talk about the Lindenmeier site. My goal is not to really tell you too much about it. The Fort Collins Museum has a wonderful booklet back there that you can pick up. It gives you a sense of the history of the site. Dr. Williamson's concluding report is actually available as a PDF that you can download from the Smithsonian's website. There's lots of materials that are available. I'm going to summarize what I've been doing over the last 9 years since 2006 at the site itself, but also within the kind of the surrounding area, many of those lands that Dalen described about an hour ago. And I'm going to help use these surrounding archaeological sites to provide context, to examine Lindenmeier within its natural space. So over the next couple of days, a lot of folks are going to be talking about Folsom and Paleo-Indians and how wonderful those things are. But those sites they're going to be discussing are mainly, in some cases, places a long ways away from here. We'll have some speeches about Lindenmeier itself, the artifacts from it. But in my worldview, how I kind of conduct archaeology, I think one of the more meaningful ways is to see how cross-culturally people might have used the same place differently. And that's kind of what the nature of the research that I conduct and that I conduct with my with my students, that's what it's all about. So I hope to provide some of that context and look at the many ways this site might necessarily be unique. My ultimate goal, though, is just to introduce this site to the audience, some of these concepts, and give you some things to think about and questions to ask over the coming days. So to begin, we'll just go through this very quickly. I'm sure most of you already know these details. The introduction of the Lindenmeier site. It is on the National Register of Historic Places. It's also a National Historic Landmark, and so for Native American sites, this is actually a very rare thing within the state of Colorado to have something at this level of designation. It's just below National Monument status. So you might have heard of the Chimney Rock Pueblo down by Pagosa Springs that just made monument status. This is really almost to that equivalency of federal recognition of significance. The site was found about 90 years ago by the Coffin family. Here's Roy Coffin on the left and Claude Coffin on the right. They were, through time, able to publicize their findings first through folks like E.B. Renault, who was at the University of Denver, and then eventually contacting Frank Roberts, who was then at the Smithsonian Institution. He had previously been working with E.B. Renault and others here in Colorado, actually at Pagosa Springs, at Chimney Rock in the 1920s, But by that point, Roberts was really interested in Anasazi or ancestral Puebloan and basket maker populations in the American Southwest. Roberts became intrigued about this site, especially following the discovery of artifacts at the Folsom type site in New Mexico. Now, what the coffins found in 1924 and continued to find over the next years were these spectacular fluted points that we call them Folsom, again after the type site, the little village in northeastern New Mexico. The coffins would go on to continue working at the site alongside Roberts, and Roberts has some pretty funny notes about this. Chile Scoggin, whose journals are written about the site, has some funny things to say about these coffins as well. They tended to work in portions of the site that weren't not as significant to the Smithsonian. Portions of the site are shallowly buried, others are very deeply buried. The coffins were kind of relegated to the upper deposits where the archaeology is not very deeply exposed. And so they were very selective in the places that they chose to dig because they're really easy to get to. And here's a couple images of the Claude and Roy coffin excavating at the site. As I mentioned, the Smithsonian was eventually able to come out to the site 80 years ago, and that's really the anniversary that we're talking about at the Symposium the next couple of days. And really in November 1934, press releases were put forth by Associated Press to all the major papers announcing this discovery that the Smithsonian had made in conjunction of working with the Coffin brothers. And so you can actually see this is going to be an article in 1935 before the Smithsonian really starts their major excavations at the project, or at the site. In 1935, Cody Newton will be speaking about this. The Colorado Museum of Natural History, who were the ones that had led the main excavations at the Folsom type site, they actually came out and did work at the site, kind of surrounding the areas that Frank Roberts and the Smithsonian would be excavating. And Jesse Figgins right here was kind of the director, the principal investigator of that work. He sent a young student named John or Jack Cotter out to the site to do the work. But for the most part, the work there conducted between 1935 and 1940 was by the Smithsonian Institution, again by Dr. Frank Roberts, seen here in a couple different shots. Frank Roberts was a resident of the West. He actually was born in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Like I said, did work at the University of Denver and kind of moved up through the ranks and made it to the Smithsonian Institution. Eventually, he'd go on to work for the Bureau of American Ethnology on the River Basin surveys. Was one of the really leaders in salvage archaeology, especially after World War II, when we had major reservoir projects throughout the American West and led to the development of big reservoirs being constructed, like Horsetooth is one of the projects that the River Basin Survey investigated prior to its construction. The Smithsonian excavations lasted from 35 to 40, spectacular results, and these are all documented in Ed Wilmson's wonderful volume that I studied many years while I was in graduate school. And the things that they found during those excavations are spectacular. These are some artifacts just from the Denver Museum of Nature and Sciences collections, but we have spectacular Folsom tools. These are Folsom projectile point preforms, the tools that were kind of the earlier stages of making Folsom points. These broke during the manufacturing process, so they're rejected at the Lindenmeier site. And what I'd like for you to see is they're made of really beautiful Cherts, jaspers, and chalcedonies. A point that I'll get to a little later in this talk is the rocks that you see here, even though they're earlier stage manufacturing rejects, they're not made of local raw materials. Some tools at the site are, but for the most part, a lot of the really final stage and middle stage tools at the site are made of exotic raw materials, things that are not coming from Soapstone natural area, Soapstone Prairie natural area, or Red Mountain open space. When Folsom points are manufactured, you go through that preform process, and then they start to being used as both projectile points or hunting tools, as well as knives, things for cutting open kinds of other items. And this is a nice little sequence of Folsom points that have undergone kind of a reworking process. So these things are used once, they might break, they might snap in terms of any hunting event or something like that, and then the napper would sharpen those tools, and eventually they get smaller and smaller and smaller until they become little tiny things that we oftentimes refer to as little nubbins. They're just little tiny things that really have no remaining utility left in them, and they're rejected. Well, at places like Lindenmeier, though, we have nubbins, meaning the little tiny leftovers, but we also have some things that still have some utility. Why would you throw these things away if you could still use them? And this is one of the first enigmas I want you to think about, is why there's so much stuff at Lindenmeier. It really is something different for both Folsom sites as well as different eras. Now, the thing that I think is most significant for me, and Trelor certainly spoke about this a little earlier, for me, it's some of the decorative arts that are shown at Lindenmeier. We think other Folsom groups throughout the plains and the Rocky Mountain West were making decorative arts. But at Lindenmeier, we have some of the best evidence of it. This is one of my favorite items. This is a drill from the Denver Museum collections. This is a red hematite ochre bead, and this is my student Aaron. That drill going right into the center of that hematite bead. It's almost a perfect fit, just like a lock and a key in terms of the connection between those two. The drill itself, it's just like it's a Sears Roebuck drill bit that you just drilled some wood at your house. It was pulled out, and the cracks of that drill itself are covered with ochre. The ochre's still within the cracks of that rock. Things like these discs with little notches around them, lignite beads, as Trelor talked about as well, other kinds of work bone, really set the site apart in other ways. Not to say that other Folsom groups weren't making these things, but the preservation at Lindenmeier is pretty spectacular in terms of the preservation of these things for thousands of years. Another staggering piece of evidence at the site is really the sheer quantity of tools that were uncovered there between the 1920s and 1940s. If you were to take the collections that are held at the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery, as well as still within the Coffin family themselves, the Denver Museum and the Smithsonian, and added up all those bits and pieces of tools, you come away with a variety of counts of different kinds of tools. Just think of your garage and all the implements you might have hanging there. And the significant piece of this is to say, oh my gosh, this is a lot of stuff. Most Folsom sites that are discovered, and we found them on Red Mountain, contain only but a few implements, 1 to 2 points on average. You might ask the speakers that are coming in the next couple of days at Cattle Guard, at Barger Gulch, at other sites, how many Folsom points were recovered at that site, how many end scrapers were recovered there, to get a sense of the relative proportions between these sites. And I'll talk about these frequencies in a little bit. So there's many things that make the site special. Many things, but here are a couple things I want to highlight that I'll be talking about in the coming minutes. First, it's the sheer quantity of tools and flakes, mainly Folsom artifacts. There's other cultures that are exhibited at the site. I don't have time to talk about them today, but Folsom is the predominant cultural group. The high number of spatially segregated activity areas, or clusters, with many artifacts found in these clusters, and these clusters extending at least a half mile of space. Now, we've taken the stratigraphy at Lindenmeier, the paleosols, and be able to follow that downstream from the site for actually much more of a distance, suggesting that age deposit extends well beyond the boundaries that we think of as the Folsom Lindenmeier site there. So there might be even more clusters. I know there are, most likely clusters still buried on the site as well as downstream. Another thing that is really significant about the site is that many of the items there are made of exotic or so-called non-local raw materials. We'll talk about what that means and how other big Folsom sites are oftentimes those found on major raw material sources. And then finally, one of the things I think will help us visualize this site, especially if you can go there on Wednesday, is to think about the site's spectacular view shed. One of the things that Dalen was speaking about earlier was this Nature Conservancy, this TNC Energy by Design project about the oil and gas development that's near Meadow Springs and near Soapstone. One of the pieces that was really significant in that project from the cultural side was talking about the viewshed from Lindenmeier and making sure that if oil and gas development ever went into that area, to help them understand that those kinds of visual impacts really take away from experiencing the Lindenmeier site, experiencing Soapstone Prairie Natural Area. And I want to make that argument in the coming minutes. So first, let's go back to Ed Wilmson again. One of the things about a place like Lindenmeier, when you have such a thing that is so large that it looks like it's a major camp, what we might call a base camp, is oftentimes with base camps you have people ranging out from these locales to go out into the hinterlands to do their daily activities and then come back to a central home. And we call this central place foraging. I've put an example of one of these kinds of settlement systems of the Hadza, a group of hunter-gatherers that still live in Tanzania, in East Africa. Here we have a central home here in the red circle and these yellow squares of different radii coming out from there, and you can see major drainages here. These represent kill sites where animals were butchered and then pieces of those animals would be brought back to consume at that base camp. It's a good model for us to understand Lindenmeier. The folks that lived at Lindenmeier just didn't live at Lindenmeier. They lived within Soapstone Prairie Natural Area and Red Mountain Open Space and Belvoir Ranch. So Williamson had a really good observation, a good piece of advice. The work of testing a settlement model leaves for the future, and so this is what we began in 2006. Requires an intensive survey made over Lindenmeier and the area around it. Presumably, we're not going to see any other sites of this size, but many kill and gathering locations, plus a few moderately sized camps. Well, that gives us something to be hopeful for, right? And that certainly was what led our initial surveys beginning on Soapstone Prairie in 2006. This work has been conducted by my research team, which is from various universities, but mostly with my students through the CSU Archaeology Field Schools, which are held in the summer times, as well as a variety of undergraduate and graduate students, some of which are in attendance today. And this is our active research program, which is called the Center for Mountain and Plains Archaeology at CSU. Since 2006, we've conducted extensive surveys throughout northern Colorado, throughout northern Larimer County, actually extending into southern Wyoming. Here's Fort Collins. This is the Pawnee Grasslands, I-25 here, and this is the Roosevelt National Forest. So we're on this very narrow kind of corridor that Dalen was talking about earlier, which is very significant for wildlife management. Since 2006, we've got a good look at these lands, and the red stars indicate where we've done extensive survey work or work with collections, working with landowners, et cetera. So we have a pretty good understanding of what's going on lands to the north of us, going all the way up to about I-80 or so in southern Wyoming. Now this has taken various forms. One of the ways that we've done a lot of our work is what we call pedestrian survey, which is actually spreading ourselves across the land and just walking, looking for archaeological sites and recording them as we see. This is an example of us working in Haygood Canyon, which is part of Red Mountain Open Space, just adjacent to the Big Hole, just about 5 miles west of Lindenmeier. What we're really looking for, though, are buried archaeological sites, sites that might give us some sense of antiquity. Things on the surface are difficult to tell time, but things that come from a buried context allow us to have associations above and below them, and in some cases to be able to date them through radiocarbon means, either dating charcoal or bone. This is a good example of something that we want to look for on these surveys, and it's these buried paleosols. And it's difficult to see in this light, but here's a wonderful cut bank. In some cases, these are 20 to 30 feet tall. And if you look in the cut bank, you have these buried black lines here. These are ancient surfaces called paleosols, so soils that are now buried in the surface, below the surface. And they allow us to time travel, right? So we can look in the sidewall itself for buried archaeological sites, or in some cases, the paleosols come to the surface. And if you look, there's a little exposed line there, and then Nick Joes right here is walking another one of these lines. Any artifacts eroding out of the soil here have the equivalent age of this paleosol off to the left here. So in some cases, ancient things could be laying on the site surface. And this is certainly what's going on at Lindenmeier, where we can have artifacts 15 feet below the surface and Folsom artifacts on the site surface, and they all date to the same age. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit. We've also had luck and good luck in our excavations on a variety of sites in both Soapstone and Red Mountain and elsewhere within Larimer and Boulder counties. This is some excavations in Red Mountain Open Space on Line Shack Draw, where we have radiocarbon dates extending all the way back into the early Holocene, so about 6,000, early to middle Holocene, about 6,000 years ago, a period that we call the early Archaic. Again, what we're looking for are these buried soils and buried deposits to help us find other sites equivalent of age to Lindenmeier. Here's an example from Red Mountain Open Space. My former student Chaz Evans, who now works for the Conservancy, Archaeological Conservancy. A buried fire pit eroding out here, not very old, kind of from the Middle Ages, about 1300 AD or so. Below that, a 3,000-year-old level filled with little bits and pieces of flakes and broken stone tools. And below his feet, we have even older deposits, Okay, so one of these kind of layer cake situations. Again, this is how we can better understand time. So we paid an enormous amount of time to these cut banks or arroyos because they allow us to better time travel than just randomly digging holes across the landscape. That's a lot of time. These arroyos allow cross sections of these sediments. So what have we learned? The main focus of that work, a lot of it was done in advance of the building of that management plan that Dalen spoke about. We wanted to give a sense of the cultural resources on these properties so that they could be protected. Meanwhile, we're conducting research on them at the same time to understand what they actually are. We were able to record over 260 newly found archaeological sites. We know of others still, but just haven't had the time to do that work. Most of that survey work was conducted between 2006 and 2007, and some 8,500 acres were examined during the survey, which is about 25% of all lands within Soapstone and Red Mountain. We ranked those lands according to a variety of ecological factors and kind of sampled them in relation to both vegetation communities, slope, distance to water, et cetera. So we have a very good sample of those properties, although by no means do we know everything that occurred in those properties in the past. Between 2008 and 2011, I took the annual field schools out to these properties and did more intensive work at some of the select better sites out there in terms of the ones that yielded more materials. And that ended up being 15 sites that we've tested, mapped, and dated between 2008 and 2011. And we're just now finishing the final reports on that work. The survey reports are already out. In terms of the sites that we found, if you were to get George Frizen's Prehistoric Hunters of the High Plains, I mean, he is the plains archaeology guru. He'll be speaking tomorrow morning. Get his book out and look from A to Z of the pantheon of Great Plains archaeology. That's what we found on these properties. A to Z, a little bit of everything out there. Stone circle sites, hearths and fire pits, surface and buried lithic scatters, cairns, animal butchery sites, you name it. We have artifacts from every period of time represented. On Soapstone Red Mountain, artifacts dating all the way back to Folsom that are not from the Lindenmeier site, all the way through the contact period, or really to the 19th century, especially on Red Mountain open space, and a point I'll return to that later in this talk. Today, we haven't found any Clovis on these surveys, but close by, we actually have a legitimate real Clovis site that's only just south of Soapstone Prairie Natural Area. So it really does represent a nice cross-section of Native American time over the last 10 to 12,000 years or so. Now here's a map documenting those finds, just to give you a sense of what we've been doing in our busy work. This square here is 640 acres, or a square mile. So this is a very large area. Here's I-25. This is Soapstone Prairie. This is Red Mountain open space, and there's some other conserved lands there. All the red dots are archaeological sites that are now documented north of town. The lighter tan or brown polygons that you see here are all the areas that we actually looked or we surveyed. So you can get a sense of where we looked and actually where we found the sites. In some places where you don't have any dots or any brown, we haven't looked there just yet, at least in an intensive way. Okay? Now, this is a very good sample to kind of compare to the uniqueness of the Lindenmeier site, and I'm going to draw some other analogies in the minutes that are coming today from another cluster of sites called the Roberts Ranch, which is held in conservation easement. It's just north of town by Livermore, and CSU did extensive work on the Roberts Ranch between 1968 and 1985, and it's a wonderful comparison to our lands that we have in Soapstone and Red Mountain. So I'll be talking about these sites down here, and this is just a portion of that cluster of magnificent sites on the Roberts Ranch. Now, we have a lot to cover today, so I just kind of have to show you some of the highlights, but to let you know that we really do have a sense of what's going on out there. So far, for just that little map that we saw, I just shown you, we have 103 radiocarbon dates for that portion of the county, which is a lot, considering they're $500 to $750 a date. 55 of those dates are from Soapstone, Red Mountain, and the Belvoir Ranch. 48 are from the Roberts Ranch. And the majority of them, 81 of them, are from cultural strata. So they actually have really good cultural association. The other ones are geological dates that allow us to kind of help us understand what those deposits actually date to and help us understand what's above and below them. Now, if you look at the sequence, the red are the Roberts Ranch dates and the blue are in Soapstone and Red Mountain. we can see there's some obvious things going on here. In terms of the Paleo-Indian era, so the earliest peoples, our radiocarbon dates are really restricted to Soapstone and Red Mountain. Actually, they're exclusively restricted to the area of the Lindenmeier Valley. It's not that we don't have Paleo-Indian sites elsewhere, but to this date, we haven't been able to radiocarbon date them in any other locale or find buried deposits of that particular age. So that does play into one of the questions we might have about how unique the site is in terms of its preservation and its exposure. The other thing is, if you look at within the last 2,000 years here, this is 8 to about 11,500 or so radiocarbon years ago. This is the last 2,000 years, and it's a period that we call the late prehistoric, and there's an explosion of dates. Now, part of that is just due to the fact that these sites don't tend to be very deeply buried, but I'd argue that something else goes on around here, and I've spoken to various folks about this before, that there's something that changed about 2,000 years ago in nationwide in this continent in terms of Native American history. And we see that on a local level. And I'll compare and contrast that to some of the things about Lindenmeier a little bit. So what makes Lindenmeier so special? I'm going to start going through 3 of these things that I think are distinct about the site to give you some things to compare. The first one is the sheer quantity of tools and really the large number of spatially separated artifact clusters. Okay. Lindenmeier's huge. It's off the charts. It's ironic because it was the second Folsom site that was excavated after the Folsom type site in New Mexico. People will say, it's just big for 2 reasons. It's an outlier because it was so extensively excavated. It sure was. Roberts and his crew really moved some dirt. It's off the charts because it's spectacularly preserved. Okay, I'll give you that one as well. But it might also represent a series of Folsom camps where family groups repeatedly return to a favorite valley year after year, or every 2 years, every 5 years, for likely what I think are cold weather occupations. And in doing so, they left this very particular and rich and dense record that we really don't see elsewhere in this area. Not to say other Folsom sites don't show this behavior, but we don't see it much like this in Larimer County. Most other local sites are small, ephemeral, short-term occupations. That is until about 2,000 years ago, when things really changed in the late prehistoric, which is about 8,000 years later. Now, we can start drawing analogies by looking at one site type, which is called stone circles. You might hear them called as teepee rings by some folks. This is a map of northeastern Larimer County, north of town, where we've arrayed known and mapped stone circle sites. The bigger the circle, the more rings happen to be on that site. And you can see there's a really nice pattern that they follow along the hogbacks, right? They're just along that narrow red rock road, that real estate that goes north-south from here to Cheyenne and over to Laramie. And then it kind of arcs out to the left here, up on Soapstone Prairie. Lindenmeier is right about there. Now, stone circles are ubiquitous, especially in Wyoming, Alberta, Montana. I mean, they're very common there. But we certainly have a lot of them in our local area, and they're fair grounds for teaching and training students about archaeology field methods. But they can help us make some analogies to Lindenmeier, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Here's an example of the Lindenmeier crew. This is from the Edison Lohr papers at CSU, actually documenting a stone circle in Red Mountain open space. This is at the mouth of Haygood Canyon. Actually, just adjacent to this ring, we actually have glass trade beads, suggesting that this rock ring really dates to the contact era. It probably is a teepee ring, only 200 years or so in age. Now, as I mentioned, I use these as training ground for students because they're really useful for doing a lot of field methods. We've done some excavations on them. Actually, we have a thesis project. One of my students in the room here is working on these for her thesis. But they're useful for mapping because we can actually see households. We can actually see former tents or campsites. This is an example of one of these on Soapstone Prairie, a site called Cactus Flats. If you've ridden the bike trail or taken a horse to the east from the south parking lot, you go into the general vicinity of this Cactus Flat site. And I would say, when Dalen's talking about the shortgrass prairies, the stone circles, they're all over the shortgrass prairies. If you go onto the Pawnee Grassland, there's extensive amounts of stone circles out on the shortgrass plains. We can do things with them in terms of mapping. Here's examples of stone circles that are drawn by the students in very meticulous ways where we can actually see doorways and interior hearths within the centers of these rings. And then we map all the rings on a site. You can actually see a site layout, right? You can actually see clusters of rings, right, representing how people were using that camp. Now, this might represent a very large site. This one has a little over 20 rings on it at Cactus Flats, or it might represent a site that was continually reoccupied. Again, analogous to what we're talking about at Lindenmeier. The spatial distribution of these rings, the clustering of them and their distance between each other are great models to use for mobile campsites, again, compared to Lindenmeier. Holding space constant, hunter-gatherers in both places, an interesting comparison. Now, the thing about stone circles, everybody acknowledges, all archaeologists will acknowledge that these are temporal, ephemeral camps. Excavations can find things in them. We have excavated them in Larimer County, and some rings have lots of things in them. Some rings don't have very many things in them at all, probably related to the seasonality of the use of them. But in general, these are thought to be very mobile hunter-gatherers, folks that are moving across the landscape pretty rapidly. They're much more mobile than earlier Folsom groups, at least when we compare them to sites like Lindenmeier, or Barger Gulch, or Hell Gap, or Agate Basin, or Cattle Guard, some of the sites that you'll be hearing about over the next couple of days. So when people say Folsom, these are highly mobile folks that are moving, cruising for the high plains from Texas to Wyoming to Montana. Well, maybe relative within Folsom, but what compared to cultures that came afterwards? These teepee rings certainly, or stone circles, are very different in many ways. As I mentioned, the camp arrangement can be compared to other kinds of organizations. Another example of one of these sites that's very different than what we see at Lindenmeier is a site that's not too far away, Black Shell Arroyo, in the southwestern portion of Soapstone Prairie. Here we have an arroyo that's, due to overgrazing, is completely downcut 30 feet below the surface. And adjacent to it, we have completely lack of vegetation. No vegetation whatsoever. So it's a very good window for looking at artifacts. Now, this site has been actively collected since at least the 1930s. Roy Coffin and Iber Renault have notes of this in the 1930s about all these blackened cobble hearths that are scattered throughout this portion of Soapstone Prairie. But we selected this site to do some investigations there to get a sense of the local raw material landscape and to get a sense of camp layout, because Mother Nature has now excavated that site for us. It's taken the top 10 to 20 centimeters of surface away, and we can look at the camp arrangement at that particular place. A small assemblage of flakes, a larger number of tools. What's interesting about this site is adjacent to a raw material source. So the way those tools are being made, the way the flakes are being reduced to make tools, gives us a comparison to what we'll see at Lindenmeier. Are they using the same raw materials? Are they doing it in the same way? The answer is no. The sites yielded 16 plus thermal features. Every year, Mother Nature exposes new ones, and then they get washed away. We've been able to salvage some of them. There's the field school excavating some of these rock features. Michael Troyer's master's thesis was a compilation of over 200 radiocarbon dated hearths from northern Colorado. And we excavated these things to understand what kinds of items were being cooked in these hearths by prehistoric folks, by native folks in the past. So we gathered all the plant material, all the sediment from these features and ran it through a series of flotation techniques and small little screens to capture all the different kinds of plant parts and fuel wood that was being cooked in these things. And then we're able to date them because they're filled with charcoal. And this site and the adjacent site, which we call Shady Grove, we have 5 radiocarbon dated features now that all date within about 1,020 to 1050, about 1,000 years or so during this early ceramic period. These sites really look like we have, like we see at Lindenmeier, many repeated occupations of the site and others nearby during the early ceramic period for the purposes of baking plants, not hunting bison, baking plants, and manufacturing tools, small tools from local raw materials. So again, give us a little snapshot. We'll get into a residential structure from this period in just a second. That site is Kinney Spring. This is the subject of Ben Perlmutter's master's thesis at CSU. This was excavated before my time at the department. Dr. Liz Ann Morris excavated the site between 1983 and 1985, and this is the Lindenmeier of its equivalent age. Okay, this is from the late prehistoric or early ceramic era. She opened up a very large area, 176 square meters. Let's compare that to 1,800 square meters at Lindenmeier, nearly tenfold were excavated by Roberts and his team Today, to excavate 176 meters, that's a lot of dirt for people to move. And in some cases, the deposits, or the excavations, I should say, they went down 3 to 4 meters below the surface, right? 3 to 4 yards below the surface, down into this cut bank, right? There's a beautiful spring just upstream from this cut bank. The earliest data deposits at the site go back to the early to mid Holocene, a little over 5,400 years ago. And this is actually one of the oldest dated sites that we have on the Roberts Ranch. What's significant about this site is that it has a house. And if folks were ever able to go back into Lindenmeier, I suspect there's houses there as well. I think it's the same kind of site. I think Barger Gulch is the same kind of site that we see at Lindenmeier. Here we have Kenny and Excavation, and this is the massive cut bank. Here's some folks there for scale. If you look at this photo, here's excavations in progress. Can you see this? It's kind of hard to see in the photo, but it's really, really black dirt. And that black dirt is charcoal and organic materials. This is just trash. This is kitchen trash. And then when it went down into this deposit, sure enough, this is an oblique shot. This is the remains of a rock house. And as they went down farther and farther and farther into the house, they actually had a log superstructure, or the wooden superstructure, that burned and collapsed onto the floor of that house. So this is a residential base. We think it's a winter camp. And it really follows that way in our models of land use in Larimer County, really for the last 12,000 years. When we look at the tool counts, my student Ben just provided this to me just the other day. Just from the era, about 1,000 years ago, we have 341 tools compared to 461 for the whole site. This is the 10th the excavation that was seen at Lindenmeier. Projectile points, 67. Ceramic era flakes, 10,209. This is through quarter-inch screen, which, if you're an archaeologist, that's pretty coarse recovery methods. At least 54 thermal features. This is something different. This is something that starts happening in the last 2,000 years ago when people start changing the way they're using northern Colorado. We haven't seen this since the Lindenmeier site, at least locally. Moving on. Another difference about Lindenmeier, the many items made from non-local or exotic raw materials. Lindenmeier is not a camp quarry site. It's not sitting on an area where they're mining rocks to make stone tools. Oftentimes when you do that, you make a lot of stone tools. You make a big mess because you have lots of things that you're willing to waste. So why is it so large given its raw material regime? It's not located on a raw material source. I'll show you this in just a second. Although we do have local tools that are made, early stage tools that are made of local materials. Many of the tools there are made of raw materials that come from at least 150 kilometers away. So southeastern Wyoming, north of the North Platte River. If estimates are right in terms of identifications, there might actually I'm so excited, the distance. There might even be Edwards Chert at Lindenmeier, which comes from central Texas, outside of Austin, going up to Waco and over to San Antonio, over 1,200 kilometers away. We definitely have albates there from the Texas Panhandle, just north of Amarillo. We also have obsidian there. The closest sources, and we've done a lot of work with obsidian sources that are of sufficient quality, would be Yellowstone National Park at Obsidian Cliff and Valles Caldera outside of Santa Fe. So some rocks are traveling great distances there. Paleo pink, so-called Chusca Chert from the Four Corners on the Navajo Nation, where the four states come together today. Now local sites, many large Folsom camps, though, are located near these large, high-quality raw material sources. Okay, we'll draw that distinction. Local sites, they're small, contain small amounts of tools and debitage because they're not found near local raw material sources, right? As we get closer to those sources, the sites get very big. So Folsom folks are moving rocks in a different way, moving these stone around, either through trade or moving themselves through direct procurement or task groups over large distances, something that we don't see as commonly in later periods. Examples of these. This is Barger Gulch. Dr. Waguespack will be speaking about this, I think, tomorrow over in Grand County, just kind of south of the town of Kremling. A wonderful series of Folsom houses, probably winter camps, located in Middle Park, which is an interesting place to spend your winter times. Here's the University of Wyoming's crew excavating that site in the 90s and into the early 2000s. It's sitting real close to good quality sources of Kremling chert, or so-called troublesome formation, some of which we actually see at Lindenmeier. We actually see it a lot in the high mountain sites. It's definitely a rock that travels pretty extensively into the mountain sites in the late prehistoric period. Other examples of these classic kinds of Folsom sites that are sitting on or real close to really high quality sources are places like Hell Gap, just north of Guernsey, Wyoming, sitting within a very beautiful chert source, dendritic cherts, many of which show up at Folsom, or excuse me, at the Lindenmeier site. These rocks seem to be coming down from the south. It's about 120 kilometers away. These are examples of more classic examples of Folsom sites that are real close to really abundant raw material sources. We have them at Lindenmeier, but they're not that high quality. So to give an example of this is some of our work at the site. We're not going to talk too much about my work at Lindenmeier today, but some of the things that Dalen was talking about, we really do understand where artifacts are occurring on the site in both three dimensions. And we've used that for management purposes, and we've also started to draw some hypotheses about how the site was used by past peoples. Here's the field school crew working on the east side of the site, which is one of the lesser known locales at the site, an area that was abandoned by the Smithsonian in terms of future work after 1935. They put some limited work there that particular year. It's the area of the so-called bison pit. Treloar talked about the famous cervical vertebrae of the bison that had a Folsom point near the neural arch, right, that Lorne Isley wrote that poem about many years ago and talked about. This was looks to be a bison kill, although there were stratified deposits above it. The M&I is about 12 bison or so. It's the greatest concentration of bone on the entire Lindenmeier site. Now what's interesting is this piece of the site looks like a bison kill. If we move about 80 meters away, we go to the original find spot of the Coffin brothers in 1924. This is some shots in December 1934, some 10 years later. And this is the area they first brought Frank Roberts to the site. And you can read their descriptions here. Our initial subsurface explorations produced 26 of these utensils, end scrapers, with much fragmentary material in a 9 by 12 feet. And here again, another letter from Claude Coffin to Frank Roberts kind of stating the same thing. Lots and lots of end scrapers. So within a very short distance from one to the other, we have a bison kill, and it looks to be a processing camp filled with high processing tools that are oftentimes used for them, these so-called end scrapers. And I'm sure that Dr. Jodry will be talking about this in relation to cattle guard in the coming days. We've done work plotting these things on their surface. This is a total station map. Every item is piece plotted to the nearest millimeter or so, and you can see the dense distribution of things. These are 10 meter by 10 meter squares. And we surface collect this 1 to 2 times a year. Mother Nature brings things up, especially after harsh storms, windstorms. And it's filled with little lithic tools and flakes, actually a very high tool to flake ratio, which is something that's very common within Folsom traditions, to have a lot more tools than is expected given the quantity of flakes. You might expect that in highly mobile peoples when they're not carrying a lot of the masses of rocks with them, but just really the tools they're carrying in their backpacks. We also had lots of little bone fragments and tooth fragments that suggest that scenario of a bison camp or bison kill in a processing area. These are some of the tools from that particular portion of the site. A little ear of a Folsom point. We have 2 other Folsom fragments from this portion of the site. We actually turned up an unfluted Folsom or Midland point just this last summer at that area. We also have later components. These are from later in prehistory, very different raw materials than we see in the Folsom traditions. Gravers, these little kind of projections here for poking into softer materials like hides or perhaps scribing bone. And then broken preforms, those preforms for making stone tools that oftentimes break in manufacture, in some cases completely burned. This isn't a prairie fire. This is coming out of a hearth where these things were scorched beyond belief. And then loads and loads and loads of end scrapers. There'll be a new thesis on end scrapers from Josh Boyd, who's a student at the University of Wyoming. He just traveled to the Smithsonian to look at the Lindenmeier end scrapers. He's been down here looking at ours, or City of Fort Collins, already. When you tabulate that flake assemblage, and this is just a little histogram to show you that most of these flakes are tiny. 12.5 millimeters is the mean length. It's just a little over a centimeter in size. Really tiny little things. We get differences between those that have cortex or kind of a chalky rind, kind of the analogous would be the onion skin, right? As you take an onion into the interior, you remove that skin. As you flake rocks, you remove that cortex. A small percentage of them have, about 11% have cortex, and those are statistically larger. Those are our local raw materials. All these flakes, the majority of these are little tiny ones that are coming from a long distance away. Most of these look to be Hartville uplift from southeastern Wyoming. But this is not, again, a manufacturing locale per se. It's not a classic camp quarry. Here's an example of this. This is a lot to look at, but this is one of those beautiful maps of the geology of northern Colorado. And I've plotted Lindenmeier here with different radii of rings coming out, 0.5 kilometer, 2.5 kilometers, 5 kilometers, 7.5, 10 kilometers, so in case you want to run a race out there. And the red diamonds and yellow diamonds represent different kinds of raw material sources that we've identified. We've taken 18 raw material samples within Lindenmeier, within 0.5 kilometer of the site itself, and as you go out, you see different ones distances away. The red are those in bedrock, so they're coming out of rock that's solidly in the hogbacks, and the yellows that are those that are secondarily deposited. What you can see in here is that we do have raw material sources throughout this area, but they're not necessarily of sufficient quality or quantity to be very useful or to really be a pull for folks to come to the Folsom site or the Lindenmeier site. So the question is, if they're not coming for rocks, what are they coming for? Why are they coming to this spot time after time after time again? Again, a huge chart. And I put this in here just to impress you that we can make charts, right, in Excel. And I've color-coded them into things that we call local sources and things that are exotic. The local ones are ones that have been identified by researchers in the Symposium, including Cody Newton, he and I put this work together, but also folks like Bridget Ambler as part of her master's thesis and Peggy Jodry as part of her dissertation. We have a good handle that distant raw materials from 145 to over 1,000 kilometers away are probably being incorporated into that Lindenmeier assemblage. We have local things, but the question is, how popular were they? And were they a draw? They certainly weren't a draw for other sites, other cultures, other eras on Soapstone Road Mountain. Here again is a survey map of our sites that we found, now with the property boundaries of Soapstone and Red Mountain. Lots of dots there, Lindenmeier being the black star. And when we tabulate the surface assemblages there in terms of the quantity of stuff that comes off these sites, this is the surface, so it's not the same as excavating these sites. We see that soapstone sites tend to be smaller in the quantity of debitage or flakes that come off those sites, in tools, in projectile points. Red Mountain is consistently yielding larger sites. Why? It's closest to more raw material sources, better quality sources, and really well-protected places. If you've been to Red Mountain, you've been to Soapstone, you'd think you're in two different places. They are two different environments, even though they're so close to one another, just kilometers apart. What does that mean? Well, we can look again to the Roberts Ranch, where we've conducted major excavations that we're working on with our student research at CSU. As I mentioned, between 68 and 85, CSU worked on the property, and between 71 and 85, excavated a series of massive encampments surrounding Spring Gulch, which is right off County Road 80 right here. Some of you have probably been here before. These are all excavations that CSU has produced. Some of these are master's theses. Some of these are actually ongoing projects by students in this room. Let me draw a difference to you in terms of how these sites look in terms of the raw material landscape as compared to Soapstone and Red Mountain. We'll talk about the Saltbox Site, just one that I pulled out of a bag. Here's the Saltbox Site, located adjacent to Campbell Mountain, which is on the south side of County Road 80. It's the most major raw material source in Larimer County in terms of quartzite source, a metamorphosed sandstone that's pretty good quality, makes really nice stone tools. From Saltbox, just from the surface alone, 3,911 flakes have been picked up. Now, these are things that can be picked up very easily. Almost 6 kilograms of rock have been picked up from that site surface. The point being, if you are close to raw material sources, sites get really, really, really big. Lindenmeier is not near a raw material source. These Roberts Ranch sites are. That's why Kenny Springs is so large, because they could use all that rock that's adjacent to the site from Campbell Mountain. 70% of the flakes from that site are of that local quartzite. not traveling very far. And if you look at this table down here to the bottom, we calculate them by various different sizes. But in yellow, I've highlighted to show you that most of the very large flakes there are made of that quartzite. Okay, big stuff is traveling short distances. Not what we're seeing on Soapstone and Red Mountain. Not the behavior that's manifest really in the same ways at Lindenmeier. Finally, what makes Lindenmeier so special? The one I've been waiting to tell you about. This is out there, right? It's the viewshed. The viewshed is spectacular. If the Great Shoregrass Plains to the east are an ocean of grass, then Lindenmeier is sitting along the ocean shoreline. It's a prime place to move between ecosystems. We live along I-25 for a reason. Peoples of the past did the same. All the way from northern Montana Glacier all the way down to Santa Fe. We could follow that mountain range all the way down. It's twists and turns. At Lindenmeier, the viewshed is paramount. You can literally see and be seen for miles, and I want you to think about this when you're up there on Wednesday. I argue that during Folsom times, although we have some evidence from these earliest peoples, that this is an era where people are pretty much getting along. Sure, there's there's person-to-person conflict, but it doesn't look like anywhere in North America we have any sort of organized group conflict. Strangers would have been welcome to come visit and to interact with people. You need that trade and exchange of information as well as genetic material between groups. How do you manage this empty landscape? Dr. Stanford will be talking about the peopling of the Americas. How long had people been here? I don't know. Ask him. But I'll tell you what, even at Folsom times, I think this was an uncrowded landscape. I'm sure they were complaining about people moving in and ruining the local economy, as was getting good press in the Folsom papers, right? Just as we do here in Larimer County. I think these people wanted people to find them. They wanted to be seen. And from this place they select, they can see great distances. And I'll say this is an interesting way that we should start looking at a variety of Native American sites, but especially in these earliest peoples in their sites. The red cliffs and Oligocene white beds can be seen at least 50 kilometers away. If we go to the hogbacks outside of town here, I could show you Lindenmeier from Hughes Stadium, right above Hughes Stadium. Now, whether those white beds would have been exposed in Paleoindian times or covered with dirt and have now exposed, that's arguable, but the red cliffs most likely would have been possible or seen in Ice Age times. The ability to see and be seen. Ask the Paleoindian experts in this room, when they've been on classic Paleoindian sites, how they feel. They might not want to tell you. It's too wishy-washy stuff. They can't prove it. But these big sites have special qualities that many of us recognize. And I don't know what to do with these kinds of things, but I want you to think about them nevertheless. Okay? This is a panoramic shot of the site taken last summer. It was so big I couldn't put it onto one slide all the way across, but this is looking to the due east, I-25, the Terry Ranch windmills right there. This is looking down the valley of Lindenmeier. This is the White Cliffs, Oligocene Cliffs. We're going to start swinging to the south. This is due south. We pick up the due south again here and swing to the west. And here's Folsom Man Hill. A dramatic south-facing aspect. A wonderful kind of aspect that you'd want in a winter house, right? Who doesn't want a south? You don't want a north-facing house in the wintertime. Your ice never melts in your driveway, right? This is not where you want to live. To these folks, the south might have been an important piece of their habitation of this spot. What drew them to this spot? It wasn't the raw materials, remind you. It's not a very protected place. Even in Folsom times, it probably wasn't that protected as compared to elsewhere. On clear days, you can easily see Pikes Peak, right? Halfway across our state. This is a GIS viewshed. In computers and in geographic information systems, we can do a variety of calculations and say, hey, what can you see? This plan went into what we talked with Dale and Figgs in terms of the oil and gas development. We don't want to see oil and gas wells when you're staying at Lindenmeier. So in this particular shot, with a 10-kilometer buffer from Lindenmeier right here, the black denotes areas that you can visibly see with the naked eye of someone who's 6 feet tall, right? So a tremendous viewshed to the south and to the east. Almost no viewshed to the north, and this is the Hogback Ridge, the Great Dakota Hogback that goes all the way down to New Mexico, that divides Soapstone from Red Mountain. You cannot see over that hogback. A dramatic viewshed. Again, this is ways of quantifying what we can see. a different sense than just touching things. If we remove that buffer and look at the entire state of Colorado, it's pretty spectacular what we can see. Now, I kind of doubt that you can see or could differentiate Kit Carson County out here along I-70 in eastern Colorado or up here towards Holyoke. But you could definitely see the South Platte Basin. These are all the tributary drainages, like Bijou Creek, coming down into the South Platte. Here's the South Platte. And as you come up this hill, this is what we call the Palmer Divide. There's where the weather changes in Colorado between Colorado Springs and Denver. You can see all the way to that rim. This is the Platte River Basin. You can see into the mountains a little bit. On a clear day, you can see the Mummy Range, so the northern part of Rocky Mountain National Park. You can see going over Cameron Pass into North Park, a very important pathway for Folsom folks to get into Middle Park, where Nicole works. You can see Longs Peak very, very clearly, and you can also see Pikes Peak, Colorado Springs. Unfortunately, I hoped that I should also be able to see the Laramie Mountain, right? The kind of the highest peak north of Cheyenne going on the way to Casper. But when you climb the high ridge north of Lindenmeier, you actually can't see Laramie Peak, which is unfortunate because if that was the case, you could see halfway across Colorado and almost halfway across Wyoming. But here we have a tremendous viewshed to the south. Just as a comparison, here are two other Folsom locales in our county. Actually, the next largest Folsom site is the so-called Johnson site, right in the Owl Canyon Pinyon Grove, just south of the Roberts Ranch. And then another site that Spencer Pelton, who's in the audience, helped write up called Spring Canyon, which is actually here in town, right by Horsetooth Dog Park. Small little Folsom sites. This site right here has about 24 Folsom points up in the Pinyon Grove. If you look, we have the same 10-kilometer buffer. The black is depicted. Very little view sheds at these smaller places. In those places that are just small task groups and small family groups, what they're looking at didn't matter. It wasn't important to them. We can quantify that just as a simple bar chart. Here's Lindenmeier. If we take the entire view shed, including the north end consideration, you can still see about 21% of all lands from Lindenmeier. If we just look at the southern view shed, it goes to almost 50% of all lands are visible to the south. Johnson and Spring Canyon are very small, minor. Well, how does this compare to other Folsom sites? The Mountaineer Site, located in Gunnison, Colorado, excavated by Dr. Mark Steiger of Western State College, as well as Southern Methodist University. My old advisor, Dave Meltzer, his students, Brian Andrews being one of them, have excavated this place for the last 10 years or so. On top of this mesa, massive Folsom site, quartzite, local raw materials, burned daub. This guy is such a crazy guy that on his sabbatical, he took all that burned daub and played with it as a three-dimensional puzzle, reassembled that daub together, and sure enough, the poles that were formerly within that clay were visible, and he could pour plaster in them and see cross-sections of the wooden poles that formerly were the structures at the Mountaineer Site. Okay? Arguable, some people don't necessarily buy it as much, but probably houses here at Mountaineer, definitely houses at Barger or Barger. The ability to see and be seen. Where is that site in Gunnison? Is it down on the floor? Well, if you've ever been in Gunnison in the wintertime, the last place you want to be is down near the water because it's darn cold. Temperature inversions being what they are, you want to go higher. The site's on top of W Mountain. You climb to the top, and you have this amazing view shed there to the north, looking up towards Crested Butte and along all those drainages that coalesce and flow west out of Gunnison. The view from that side as well as from Lindenmeier, both places that are perhaps winter encampments. Imagine bison grazing in that wind-blown, Chinook-blown, snow-free area to the south in patches of snow and in solid snow. They would have looked like brown raisins in yogurt, right, against that white snow. How important that would have been for food for these folks to be able to monitor where those animals are, especially in overwintering situations where you're hunkered down in these winter camps for weeks, if not months at a time. It's important to these folks. Let's talk about this with these other researchers in the next couple of days, see what they have to say. Well, Lindenmeier is the biggest site by far on Soapstone. There's nothing comparable. The rest, the big sites, are teepee rings, stone circles. Where are the big sites? As I mentioned, they're in Red Mountain. They're across the hill. This is standing up on top of the rim, looking down into Red Mountain. Here's the beautiful mummies right here. This is looking towards Cameron Pass into North Park. The sites, the big sites, are all down here, and then Roberts Ranch is just over that hill. Down on the floor, we're in the Big Hole, a place that affords water, wood, cover, raw material sources, things that are not necessarily as ample on Soapstone Prairie. As a difference in view sheds, let's contrast Cody Newton's thesis site. Cody will be here in the morning. This is the Lycans Valley site, a contact era site, only about 200 years old. It had trade goods, glass trade beads, clay pipes, as well as stone tools from Native American groups that were trading or living, interacting with people bringing these trade goods in from the eastern United States and actually from overseas. This middle ground. During this era, horse raiding, conflict, evasion of other folks was a big deal for these folks. It was a changing world. It was a collision in so many different ways, a very tragic one. Most of the protohistoric or contact era sites that we only have one just south of Soapstone. The rest are in Red Mountain and along this so-called Red Rock Road that the Arapahoes talked about 100 years ago in the Arapaho place names. They're in very sheltered areas near entrances to protected canyons. Now, why are they selecting this place? Why aren't they out on Soapstone? Are they selecting them for wood, water, the grazing area afforded in places like the Big Hole in the wintertime for horses? Or is it for conflict avoidance? Here's another local example of one of these late contact era sites in southern Larimer County. This is near Masonville. It's a site we call the Mini Guns site. This is a rock shelter. At the back of that rock shelter, this is an image-enhanced photo to bring them out there in charcoal. It's a series of rifles in a row. I could show you many different examples, but this is an example from southern Colorado and southern Montana of very similar scenes that Larry Lorendorf calls coup counts, raiding scenes of people coming into people's camps, raiding them, stealing horses, stealing livestock, stealing equipment, and moving out again. During that last 200 years, the place they were setting was very important to them. Conflict avoidance was a very big deal, very different than those earlier times like Lindenmeier. So returning, Lindenmeier is indeed unique. Going back to Dr. Wilmson, he goes on to say, its distinctive features are explainable most economically in terms of its place as one member location instead of functionally related locations. Lindenmeier is most likely a base camp, serving as a hub for task groups venturing throughout these properties in northern Colorado. But I ask you, when we look at these Folsom sites that are spread from Alberta to northern Mexico, kind of into Utah, and kind of into the eastern plains states, we have points going beyond there, but this is the main range, north to south, east to west. I ask you, how unique is unique? Tell me why the largest and most complex Folsom site is located in the very center of the primary Folsom distribution, the edge between the mountains and the plains. I'm happy to say that's coincidence, but I want to ask you and engage you to say, could it be something else? So conclusions, if Lindenmeier isn't unique, it certainly is distinct. It's something different. It's different than most other sites of other periods in local areas. I could go on, but I'll keep it at this. It's densely and repeatedly reoccupied. It's not located on a raw material source. So why was that place repeatedly chosen? Why did they keep coming back to that spot? And what was the importance, if any, and I'll concede that there is no importance, of its viewshed? So let's explore this importance of this very special place over the coming days in our discussions as well as our travels to the site. And as the cartoon says, let's go to Lindenmeier. So in terms of acknowledgments, I have many, many people to thank as well, including my field crews over the various years. But mostly I'd like to thank my graduate students, many of which are here today, but past students as well, in particular Cody Newton, Aaron Liefeld, Michael Troyer, Spencer Pelton, Chris Johnston, Ben Perlmutter, and Hallie Meeker. I have a defense this coming Friday, so I need to read that in between all these things. Lots of volunteers that have helped us, lots of different kinds of funding sources, including the State Historical Fund, which is funded through gambling in the state of Colorado. So with that, I thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. So I was asked to repeat the questions. The question is, are there plans for any additional excavations? Well, isn't that the million-dollar question? Of course, there are many new questions that could be asked with further excavations. And I certainly would support that work. There's been a tremendous amount of work with the collections that exist today. That was the nature of Wilmson's investigations. Dr. Soleil and Dr. Newton and Bridget Ambler will be speaking about this in the coming days. There's a lot that could be learned from those extant collections. I'm a conservation archaeologist, I believe. Use what we have already, but golly, there is a lot to be done. In particular, I think the east side which is what I talked about briefly, near the bison pit, that processing area. I think there's many new questions that could be answered by excavating that particular portion of the site in a very minimal, extractive way that does little damage to the site. The question is what Native people would have said about Lindenmeier and the importance of the place. I've been on different tribal consultations out there with Utes, Arapahoes, Cheyennes, and they recognize it as a special place. It's interesting. I went with them to Lindenmeier, then I took them to some of these sites where we have glass trade beads, which date to only 200 years ago, and the ancestral link there is probably even stronger there in terms of direct, descendant ties. And by far, they're more interested in Lindenmeier than they are in the glass trade bead sites from the last 200 years, which I found just interesting to begin with. It's difficult. I've had conversations with them, and they certainly recognize and think that the view of that place is spectacular. And I really want you to think about that. I mean, especially when it's a cloudy day or a smoggy day, and you can see Denver or can't see Denver because of the smog versus the clear days, that view is really spectacular. One of the things I would say, another thing they commented on is the fear of that it was a burial site. And I didn't talk about it today. I can go in great length about this. Frank Roberts, one of the reasons he was there was to find human remains. The idea was that the Folsom type site was Pleistocene or Ice Age in age, but the question is who those people were. Were they Neanderthals or were they modern humans? It wasn't solved at the Folsom type site. They went to Lindenmeier looking to find a cemetery, never found it. They went into the rock shelters above the site, and the Rookery Formation didn't find anything. We went up there as well, didn't find any human remains. You should know that we've never found human remains on Soapstone or Red Mountain open space. So that was their biggest fear, was that it might be, have mortuary remains as well. So yeah, we had conversations about it, but they recognize it as a special place just because it was repeatedly occupied. Well, the point is that these cultural resources matter, and their protection, well, first of all, their documentation and their ultimate protection really matters. And they are part of our community. These might seem like distant eras, but they very much viewed this place in special ways. We might not be able to decode it particularly well, but we really should reflect on past values of these places as we move forward in the future, because all of us are only on this planet for a very short period. So the choices that we make in land use really matter, and that's. But I mean, it wasn't a political reason I went up there. It was to record the archaeological sites. I mean, that is my job. That's why I did it. Yeah, that's a good question. The Roberts Ranch, that cluster of sites that's near raw material sources and springs, the excavations in some cases went meters below the surface, very, very deep. In the excavations, they never hit intact Paleogene deposits. They actually found Paleogene tools at Lightning Hill, Spring Gulch. This summer I found a Folsom channel flake at a place called Lunch Cave. So we have Paleogene deposits, Agate Basin, Cody, Folsom, at these locales, but we have yet to find them in stratigraphic association. So it's difficult to say. Without a doubt, those folks were there. They were mapped onto that spot. But why they didn't go there and choose that place to turn into their Lindenmeier, I don't know. Why they didn't turn Lindenmeier down here into the river, down on the Thompson and Poudre rivers themselves, why aren't the encampments there now? They might be buried or they might be washed away. That might be part of it, is that preservation piece. But they chose that place on Lindenmeier, and I don't think it's just an accidental preservation. Well, thank you very much.